My subject, which I am delighted to be here to speak about, is From Magna Carta to You, Life, Liberty, and the Medieval Legacy. I have done a version of this talk. It's called From Alfred to Edward to You, Canada's Lost Legacy of Liberty. But I felt as though if there were any place that would be promising to look for it, it would probably be in this audience. Because at the very least, you're not as reflexively hostile to the Middle Ages as most people are. And for another thing, you're probably more receptive to G.K. Chesterton than very many people, including his observation that the church is the one thing that saves a man from the degrading servitude of being a child of his time. So you don't automatically prefer the 21st century just because it's now. Now, to be less hostile to the Middle Ages and more receptive to Chesterton than the average audience might not be saying a whole lot, but it's a better start than I usually get. Especially the bit about Alfred. When I teach history, I always mention Alfred very early on, and I get blank looks. Now, you following the progress of education, you might think this is typical. If I mentioned Pierre Trudeau, I'd get blank looks. But there was another one. When I mentioned Justin, maybe they'd swoon. I don't know. But I start my history courses by explaining why history is important, why a narrative of the past is important. That it's because it tells us who we are, what story we're part of, and what role we're meant to play. That a society without history is like a man without a memory. They don't know who they are, they don't know where they're from, they can't decide what to do next. And after I make that point, I ask them about the story of Alfred and the cakes. Have anybody who knows about Alfred and the cakes put up their hand, and I just don't get hands in class. I don't even know, do I get hands for Alfred and the cakes here? Well, okay, a few smart Alex and figured that. But to me, it's astonishing that this story would have disappeared so totally from the awareness of the society at large. I don't actually want to insult my students. I teach at the University of Ottawa, and I find that the students are good, by and large. I was pleasantly surprised when I got back into teaching 5 years ago, but good is one thing. Knowing Alfred and the cakes is quite another. And for those of you who do not know the story, this is King of Wessex in the darkest part of the Dark Ages. In 876, Alfred, new king, his brothers having failed to bring order out of chaos, is surprised by the Danes at Christmas, nearly killed, and he flees. And then probably apocryphal story about him in the marshes of Athelney, in disguise taking refuge in a cowherd's hut. The man's out gleaning or otherwise scraping by an existence of some sort, and he asks his wife if he can come in and shelter by the fire because he's a poor lost traveler, and she doesn't like the look of him very much, but charity being an obligation, she says, come on and sit down. The only thing is watch the cakes, the little loaves of bread that are baking, while I go out and see if I can glean something. Don't let them burn. Now, Alfred sits by the fire, starts cleaning his weapons, pondering the scattered affairs of his kingdom, and where are my men? How could I rally them? What battle plan can I devise? And he gets so lost in strategy that next thing he knows, the hut's full of smoke, and the cowherd's wife is in the door screaming at him, you lazy no-good bum. I let you sit by the fire. All I said was watch the cakes. Now they're in flames. What are we going to eat? And so on. And the punchline is that instead of jumping up, drawing his sword and saying, on your knees, woman, I am the king, or swatting her head off or some other regal gesture, he apologizes, says, I'm terribly sorry, yes, I should have watched the cakes, and my bad. And then there are various embellishments, because Alfred does rally his men at Egbert's Stone and defeats the Danes, retakes London, forces the Danish king to convert to Christianity, and then goes on to teach himself Latin as an adult so that he can translate important Latin works into Anglo-Saxon for his people, divides his time among making law, praying, and working, and then founds the English Navy in his spare time to try and fend off the Danes. And what is extraordinary about the story is that it's a model of kingship that was preserved for over 1,000 years, of the humility of the monarch, his understanding that he is not above other men, that because he's king, he has heavier responsibilities, not greater rights. And this is a kind of story that you don't find in other cultures. I don't think you'd find this story about a Japanese emperor, or a Russian czar, or a Persian emperor, or something like that. And it was preserved for 1,000 years and more. It was told at the dinner table, and it told the British and the offshoots of British liberty, the Americans, the Canadians, the Australians, the New Zealanders, who they were, how they ought to be ruled. And that also, I just sneak this in on the students, is that it points out to them that there might be something good, humility of rulers, not a quality conspicuously on display these days, might not just be a good thing, but it might be an old thing. that we might enjoy good things because they were old, not because they were new. So I'm currently having fits over Apple has its new operating system. Everybody's all excited about iOS 7 because finally the iPhone will be cool. You know, it's 5 years ago you thought the iPhone was cool. What's wrong with it now? Nothing's happened to it. But we're so obsessed with novelty that the great thing about my gadgets is they'll all be completely different in a year. So they're lousy now. And people tend to think this way. And it's one of the reasons people don't like the Middle Ages, because they're old, and old is bad. And therefore, if something is terrible, you call it medieval. And that's the ultimate insult. No worse thing could possibly be said about something. And it's funny, actually, even the term the Middle Ages comes out of an older version of hating the Middle Ages, as supposedly this period between glorious antiquity and the wonderful Renaissance. There was this period of horror. And there's Alexander Pope had this poem about learning in Rome, alike an empire grew, and art still followed where her eagles flew. From the same foes at last both felt their doom, and the same age saw learning fall and roam. With tyranny then superstition joined, and as that the body, this enslaved mind, much was believed but little understood, and to be dull was construed to be good. And monks finished where the Goths began until Erasmus came along. And this kind of attitude, you know, H.G. Wells writes about this, that how marvelous antiquity was, the glorious intellectual dawn of Greece and Alexandria, and then the collapse and the cloud of religious intolerance and absolutist government darkened the promise of that beginning. The light of fearless thinking did not break through the European obscurity again effectively until the 15th and 16th centuries. So there you have the Middle Ages, just appalling period of servitude and mental bleakness and stupidity. Like this thing, the Middle Ages, people are so stupid, they thought the earth was flat. You know, and somebody arguing in favor of relativism saying, why couldn't we say that for medieval people it was true that the world was flat because what they could perceive of it was flat? Well, no, actually, this best-selling astronomy book, John Sacrobosco or Holywood, had 3 different proofs of the fact that the earth was round, including that if you watch a ship sail over the horizon, the hull disappears before the mast. And so any half-educated medieval person could not only tell you the earth was round, they could give you a convincing proof of it. And I wonder quietly how many of my students could do that. I said, okay, you've seen a photograph from space, but it could have been photoshopped. How do you know the earth is really round? And if you can get over this idea of the Middle Ages as being so terrible, then you might be open to the idea that other good things have come from the Middle Ages, and including the main subject of my talk, which is political liberty. That we did not acquire the rights of man and freedom through some slaughter in the so-called Age of Reason, some convulsion in which people were beheaded on the slightest suspicion and thus bestowed upon us the marvels we now enjoy, but that it might be something that arose organically 1,000 years ago and have been preserved despite the onslaught of modernity. And if you start thinking that way, then politicians campaigning for change becomes less appealing than it already was. And I like to befuddle my students, too. I quote this constitutional expert who says that his was a land, perhaps the only one in the universe, in which political or civil liberty is the very end and scope of the Constitution. Well, that's fine. I'm teaching American history. This is some libertarian nut. This could be Ron Paul or somebody. Actually, that's William Blackstone. That's his commentaries on the English Constitution written in the 18th century. And not only is Blackstone convinced that England is a land of liberty, but he's convinced that it has always been a land of liberty, and that what is remarkable about the English story is that liberty has been preserved despite all the odds. And at this point, I go back and tell another good story out of the Dark Ages. How about those Dark Ages kings? And this is the story of King Canute. Now, Canute is more familiar to my students by a wide margin than Alfred again. This is not saying very much, but it is true. Because once in a while, somebody will deride some politician or other figure saying, he's like Canute, he thinks he can stop the tide. Now, Canute was a sort of Danish interloper, not entirely averse to slaughtering his foes, but that was kind of the way things were done. He was king of England in a particularly troubled part of its troubled history. And yes, he did actually command the waves to stop, but the reason, again, that the story of Canute was preserved for all these years is that what happened is that his courtiers were flattering him. They were telling him what a great king he was. He was so marvelous and powerful and favored by God that he could even stop the waves. And Canute said, well, what an interesting theory that is. Somebody pick up the chair, we'll head down to the tidal flat and see how it works. Put his chair down, sat in it, in came the tide. Canute said, I command you to stop. Of course, it didn't. And he turned to his courtiers and said, hey, I'm the king. I can get flattery for free anywhere, anytime. What I need from you people is the truth. Tell me when I'm making a mistake. Tell me what I can't do. Come on. You know what happens when a king gets too conceited? And that's why the story of Canute was preserved and finally got turned on its head in these enlightened times when we even forgot what the facts were, let alone what they meant. But Canute was a model of kingship, even though he was part of this Danish interloping sequence along with Harold Harfoot and Svein Forkbeard and others you may have forgotten at some point in your studies. Because humility was an essential part of English kingship, even if you were a Danish interloper. That you knew you were not superhuman. You knew you were not gifted with the power to stop the waves. And you didn't embark upon legislative programs that required you to have this kind of ability. And it is from that tradition forward that the British were freed. John Milton in 1649 called London the Mansion House of Liberty. This was actually everyday discourse among the politically alert classes in England. In the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th century, they thought of themselves primarily as a free people, something which is tragically missing in England today. And I think they're right. I think this is a fair reading and that the other readings are wrong. And that what has happened, and this is how the American revolutionaries understood their history, is that this liberty in England was repeatedly attacked by the executive. And every time it was attacked, it was squeezed, and instead of being compressed or broken, it was formed into something more definite and with harder edges, and that you go through a series of executive attacks on the liberties of Englishmen, and every time the institutions respond by becoming stronger in defense of that freedom. And as I say to people, I think this is actually good news because Ludwig Wittgenstein once talked about the repairing a broken culture is like trying to repair a broken spider's web with your bare hands, which is a discouraging thought when you're trying to repair something that's in decay. On the other hand, at least you've got a spider web. I have enormous sympathy for people trying to build liberty in countries where there is no history of liberty. But it is an appallingly difficult task. This thing with George Bush thought, well, we'll invade Iraq, we'll get rid of Saddam Hussein and his appalling sons, and then the Iraqis will all turn into the inhabitants of suburban Cleveland or something along those lines. And, it didn't happen. So we're better off than them, though we're still in trouble. Because we are part of a tradition, and again, although this is not the way it is normally told, this is something that someone like Sir John A. Macdonald would automatically have understood. His portrayal of history as a big government guy and a drunken hack is unfair to him, although he was not allergic to a drink from time to time. But Macdonald was an advocate of liberty, and of traditional British liberty. He was proud of what he'd inherited, and he wanted to preserve it. Now, I'm going to go back to the terrible Middle Ages here because it is astounding to me the way that people talk about the Middle Ages. And you need to overcome this habit and combat it in people. One of my favorites was the UN War Crimes Tribunal chief prosecutor accusing Slobodan Milosevic of medieval savagery. You know, we should be embarrassed to speak this. This was in the 20th century. This was, what happened in the 20th century? Well, Serbs putting Albanians in concentration camps. The British Foreign Secretary said that practice belongs to the Middle Ages. It does not belong to modern Europe. Really? And Adolf Hitler was medieval, was he? Joseph Stalin was in the 14th century, you say? No, concentration camps belong in the 20th century. That's when they happened, okay? The Middle Ages didn't invent them. We invented them. Mao Zedong, Pol Pot, all medieval. And you get this thing, especially when we're dealing with militant Islam, and people will talk about a twisted medieval code of honor that requires girls to be killed for even minor infractions. Oriana Fallaci called the chador a stupid medieval rag in her interview with Ayatollah Khomeini. And I'm wondering in which medieval country people think there were burqas. I mean, again, you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts. What do you think you're talking about? And this goes on, including people who ought to know better. My colleague Ezra Levant continually talks about medieval Islam. And of course, I mean, Islam needs a Middle Ages. Among other things, it needs a pope. It needs someone to rein in the freelance fatwas. You know, again, this is just, it's just a factual point that Islam is like all Protestant and no Catholic in terms of its church structure. This may be a good thing or maybe a bad thing, but you don't get to have an opinion on whether it's true. Medieval Christianity was uniformly Catholic. Robin Hood was a Catholic, right? Everybody was Catholic. And so they all theoretically owed allegiance to the Pope, although, again, when it comes to English liberty, when the Pope would tell the king to do something as a good Catholic, a marvelous British thing, and the king would write back and say, well, of course, I'm a good Catholic and will happily do what you say, Your Holiness. Only, the thing is that as king, I cannot change the laws of England, which require the consent of Parliament. So then you go to the Parliament and say, hey, you have to do this because the Pope said so. And the parliamentarians will say, as good Catholics, we would love to oblige you. But the problem is, the British tradition of liberty and law, we cannot do anything that would take away from the king's prerogatives. And therefore, forget about it. So, wonderful Pope, but there you are. Or even George Jonas writing, and George Jonas is one of my favorite writers and a wise, humane, and witty man. But he talks about the Taliban blowing up those Buddhas and says it was a postcard from the Middle Ages. Because of course, in the Middle Ages, nobody liked religious statues. I was say, George, you ever been to a cathedral? And the point is that somebody like George Jonas doesn't normally say dumb stuff. But this prejudice against the Middle Ages is so strong that people will babble just anything. Somebody wrote of the legend of Harris Hood, criticizing Mike Harris and saying that his government was taking us back to medieval times and taking from the poor to give to the rich. I always thought that Robin Hood, took from the rich, gave back to the poor in medieval times. Or, you can't disentangle this. It's just, it's not. There's no there. People calling the feudal oil kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I mean, in feudal societies, there were mutual obligations running up and down. There weren't 5,000 princes and people suing Forbes for saying he was worth $20 billion when he says it's $27 billion, and he's got this palace with 400 rooms and a fake Grand Canyon. It's just Hamas, the medieval worldview that animates Hamas. No, it doesn't. I have tons of examples of this, but I think by now, if I haven't successfully made the point, except at one point, Ezra Levant, again, pick on Ezra here, says the Taliban is a medieval serfdom that uses Islam as an excuse. So an excuse for what? And then it turns out that it's a medieval fascism. Seriously, they just talk that way. Under the Taliban, Afghanistan was a medieval fascist state, but fascism comes from the 20th century. And the only reason you can talk like this is because you've just got this old is bad, Middle Ages is terrible, fascism is terrible, therefore fascism is medieval. And you do not stop to examine this. Google Hitler and see when he was born or something along those lines. And then people say, Canada's jails have medieval conditions, or Wapiscat has medieval conditions, all this kind of stuff. Or, that the psychiatric hospitals in the 50s were medieval in the way they were operated, as though something about stuffing people with pills and strapping them to tables reminded you of the charity of monks. Not that there probably weren't monks who misbehaved. But the fact of the matter is that the Middle Ages wasn't like that. And that's why I bring up these examples that just factually they don't work. The Middle Ages, for one thing, particularly in Northern Europe, saw the disappearance of slavery, an institution so unquestioned in the ancient world that in Rome there's no abolitionist movement. Quite extraordinary. I taught a seminar on slavery at the University of Ottawa, and mostly it was about American slavery, but we had one look back to Rome and one look forward to modern sex trade. And it was astounding looking at the Roman slavery, how it failed to strike people who in most respects you could have had a very normal conversation with, that there was something wrong with slavery. But once you're told that man is made in the image of God, and you start with you can't brand them on the face, which might not seem like a huge deal unless you were actually threatened with the prospect, in which case you'd say, okay, good, glad to hear that, that you're disfiguring the image of God, and this is a problem. And it goes on to the point that slavery somehow, without anybody expressly banning it, just disappears. By the time you get to Magna Carta, there's really no slavery left in England. It's just gone. Women had more rights in the Middle Ages by a long shot than they had in the ancient world, and in many respects more than they'd have in the Renaissance. You also get the university, the hospital, and especially in Britain, you get Parliament. 3 institutions which, as a matter of fact, have their origins in the Middle Ages. And again, if you think the 20th century is so great, what would give us concentration camps, Facebook, and chlamydia? It's just not really comparable. And particularly on the subject of liberty, and here I must say that there is something about England that is especially weird here. There is a fair degree of liberty in most of medieval Europe. There are proto-parliaments, but only in England does it really take. And this is quite an amazing thing, and it is also because people in those days weren't so dumb as to think the past was bad. And you see, when William the Conqueror takes over England, and I would have to tell my Harold Godwinson story. There's a period of confusion after Edward the Confessor dies, and there are 3 legitimate claimants to the crown. One is Edgar Atheling. He's the grandson of Edmund Ironside, a little bit too much of a stripling youth. He actually does get proclaimed king by the Witenagemot, but it doesn't really stick. Then there's Harold Godwinson, who is the leading representative of the most powerful Saxon family in England. He gets himself declared king, but he's got issues. For instance, he's about to be attacked by his own brother Tostig, along with King Harold of Norway, and by this guy across the English Channel, whose nickname, pardon my French, but was William the Bastard. So you can see where he needs a new nickname. It doesn't look good in history books. And at one point, Harold Godwinson actually sits down with his brother and he says, now what do you need so as not to invade? And his brother says 1/3 of the kingdom. And Harold says, okay, I think we could do that. But then his brother says, what about my ally Harold of Norway? And Harold Godwinson gives what really ought to be an immortal reply. He said, what will you give Harold of Norway? He says, I'll give him 6 feet of earth. Maybe a little more. I hear he's a tall man. Well, this goes down badly in Oslo. So Tostig and King Harold of Norway do invade. Harold Godwinson force marches his army north at Stamford Bridge. He catches the invaders, defeats them, kills his brother, kills the King of Norway. Here's your 7 feet of earth. Have a nice day. Then someone comes and says, William, the you-know-what, has invaded the south of England, so he force marches the army south. They meet at Hastings. The shield wall cracks. Somebody, I have this imagining, a wild shot with an arrow in the eye, and there's Harold, oh darn, on the Bayeux Tapestry, and William becomes king, and Harold is one of history's great chumps. Had the battle gone the other way, we might well be seeing him as the heroic Harold the Great, defender of Saxon liberty against the Norman threat. However, William takes over, and very quickly he says, I will respect your traditional liberties. I will observe the laws of Edward the Confessor, which in turn look back to the laws of Alfred the Great. And sometimes the king says one thing and does another. This is a real issue with the Plantagenets, like the Stuarts. And so people are always keeping an eye on William and who he's currently massacring, and his descendants, including William II, who gets killed in a hunting accident. Oh, darn, was that the king? I thought it was a deer. And then you get, and to me this is one of the most extraordinary parts of the story, you get King Henry II, Henry the Almost Great. England only has one great king, that's Alfred, but Henry was almost great. And under Henry, the English get this elaborate system of common law, which arises organically from the people, establishes the rules under which they live, and is binding. And when I talk particularly to modern audiences, I put them a puzzle. How does England get its law? There is no parliament. There is no lawmaking body. And England is not the kind of the place where law is in the mouth of the king. That line is one of the things that gets Richard II killed, is when he attempts to make that claim. Well, what Henry does is he creates royal courts that travel around the country. And this is very important because mobility is lousy in those days. You know, the king himself, one year they tried to calculate from his travels, he traveled about 2,000 miles on horseback. He must have had a very sore backside. But most people can't do this. But Henry's courts don't follow the king. They come where you are. And they get you under oath to say, what is the law? And then, what are the facts of the case? And so they figure out what the law is under which Englishmen have always lived. And the law arises from the people. And the law is the law because they've given it their consent over many, many centuries.
Which Henry and what year did they
This is Henry II. Now, you've got me on the years. He'd be early 12th century, I think, but he's probably in the notes somewhere. Am I off? He's later 12th century? Yeah, we'll see if it's in here somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, someone will Google me before I can finish my sentence. Anyway, as I said, you've got to keep an eye on these guys because Henry II and his very exciting family life results in King John being on the throne. You know, the English, sometimes a king's name wears out through sheer evilness, and in the case of John, it only took one. Various nicknames such as Soft Sword, charming, Lackland. And John comes from a family who are notorious for their violent untrustworthiness, but he somehow stands out for being just absolutely the worst and most wretched. And finally, he gets to the point where there's civil war in England, and the barons drag him to Runnymede and put Magna Carta in front of him and, you know, put an arrow to his head and say, your signature or your brains are going to be all over this document in 5 minutes, so John signs it. What is extraordinary about Magna Carta, one of several things, it's a backward-looking document. The barons are not creating rights, and the king is not granting new rights. What they're doing is confirming their rights. And these rights include such things as due process. That we shall not send, I mean, it's translated various ways, but you can only be prosecuted according to the law of the land and by judgment of your peers. There it is in 1215, as not as an innovation, but as an affirmation of how things have always been, looking back to the laws of Edward the Confessor and beyond. Also, no scutage or aid may be levied in our kingdom without its general consent, except for a couple of specified existing rights, like ransoming his eldest son or marrying his eldest daughter once. It actually says once, because with John, you never know. Now that general consent is a curious phrase to encounter in a country with no parliament. But essentially what John is agreeing to is no taxation without representation. That this is how we have always done things in England, and it is how we shall continue to do things, on pain of death. Now, because people have this prejudice against the Middle Ages, when the Magna Carta is described in history books, it's often said, well, of course, it was an aristocratic document. It eventually somehow trickled down to the common man. But it was not. Magna Carta was issued again and again by kings of England, repeatedly confirmed. Up until the 17th century, this thing kept getting reissued. And, for instance, Henry III, John's rather hapless son, who reigns for a long and undistinguished period in the 12th century, in his reconfirmation, issues it to it's a whole long list of people: archbishops, bishops, abbots, priors, blah, 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 priors, earls, barons, and to all free men of this our realm. So Magna Carta is to all free men in England. And it is read in cathedrals twice a year, because it's for everybody, including the people who cannot read. Magna Carta is for everybody. And as I mentioned, Henry III being somewhat of a lousy king, he eventually finds himself facing a very serious revolt by Simon de Montfort. And at one point in all of this, Simon decides that in terrible need for legitimacy, he's not that great either, he summons a parliament to which he invites the commoners. And it's sort of lost in the midst of time what sort of gatherings had been had before, but we know with this parliament in 1265 that the common people are invited. And this is clearly going to give legitimacy to what he is doing, because the common people in some way have a right and have always had a right to be represented. Now, things don't go terribly well for Simon. He actually captures Henry III and his son Edward, the heir apparent, but they escape. Well, Edward escapes, and Edward ambushes Simon and cuts his head off and decorates it with other parts of him. It's fairly gruesome business. These guys are playing for keeps. And then he summons a parliament, and he invites the commoners. It's extraordinary. Having just defeated the guy who summoned a parliament full of commoners, still in the 13th century, he summons a parliament, invites the commoners, and in 1297 promises the Parliament, in a statute I make my students memorize called De Tillagio non concedendo, no taxation without representation. Flat out, in Latin, unmistakable, no tallage or aid shall be levied by us or our heirs in the realm without the goodwill and assent of the archbishops, bishops, earls, barons, knights, burgesses, and other freemen of our realm. Now, when the Americans rebel in 1776 and they say no taxation without representation, they know this. They are asserting a right that is almost half a millennium old. And they're doing it on purpose, as part of the story of liberty, preserved by our ancestors, handed down from the mists of time. Thomas Jefferson actually wanted to put Hengist and Horsa on the Great Seal of the United States. Hengist and Horsa being the mythical first Saxon kings of England. Now, scholars now are not sure that either of them existed, and they're pretty sure that if Horsa did exist, he was a horse. It's not so great. Hengist may well have been a human being, which is a start. But, and this is in 1628, when King Charles I is getting out of hand, Magna Carta and De Tillagio are thrown in his face by Parliament, saying, no, it has been this way for hundreds of years, and that's why it should still be this way. So I say, Edward promises this to Parliament in 1297. This is a Parliament where everybody sits together. But by 1346, we don't know how exactly, because they were regarded as sort of a bunch of people with mud on their boots. The Commons are sitting separately from the Lords and the Bishops, uncontroversially. By 1376, and again, I say by because we don't know how it evolved or when. We're aware of a date at which it was definitely happening as established tradition. Commons is electing their own speaker, and which is critical for two reasons. One is he counts the votes. They choose the guy who counts the votes. And as many people, including Stalin, can tell you, whoever counts the votes decides who wins the election. Secondly, the Speaker is the one who speaks for the House in its dealings with the House of Lords and with the King. So the King can't find a dissident faction and get them to say, well, this is what we decided. It is the Speaker who speaks on their behalf. By 1401, they tell King Henry IV, who has just acquired the throne in a somewhat dubious manner due to the unexplained death of Richard II while in custody for being totally wretched in every imaginable way. He said, you know how we come to you with these petitions and then you want money? Well, from now on, you are going to answer our petitions before we give you a shilling. So we're starting to get the making of statute law. If the king wants supply, funds, first of all, he's got to agree to what the Commons is asking for. We're not going to give you the money and then ask you if it would be okay if. It's not going to work that way. No. 6 years later, 1407, the House of Commons tells the king and the House of Lords, money bills start with us, because we represent the people who are going to pay for this mess. That's why the American House of Representatives and the Canadian House of Commons must originate money bills, because the British Parliament asserted it during the Middle Ages in dealing with King Henry IV. And by 1414, as I said, kings can be shifty characters. Henry V, who's about to go off and fight Agincourt, the Commons sits down with him and says, Your exalted, wonderful majesty, we've noticed that although you tend to grant our petitions before we give you money, then we all go home and somebody gets out the quill and starts editing. No more of that. The text when we go home is the text when we come back. No ifs, ands, or buts. So there you have the fundamental structure of parliamentary self-government and legislative control of the executive by 1415. We're still in the Middle Ages. And what happens, of course, is that many, many people who are in power think themselves above all this nonsense and try to make it stop. Most dangerous, King Henry VIII, a frightening and appalling monarch. The Tudors are just bad news from beginning to end. Actually gets Parliament to pass a statute of proclamations in 1539 that makes the king's word law. Which is seriously, Richard II said, the law is in my mouth, and he was imprisoned, overthrown, and as I say, perished under mysterious circumstances. So Henry puts this bill to Parliament, and they say, okay, fine, your word is law, except, quote, the inheritances, lawful possessions, offices, liberties, privileges, franchises, goods, or chattels of subjects, and you can't infringe any acts, common laws, or lawful and laudable customs of the realm. In short, Anything you say is law except anything that matters, where we're right back where we were before. Thanks for coming out. And so, if you can withstand Henry VIII, you can withstand almost anything, you'd think. However, as you know, the Tudors, who spent more than a century pursuing the throne, Owen Tudor actually secretly married the widow of Henry V, resulting in a law saying no sneaky marrying of the royal widow. Apparently, he gained her attention first by throwing up on her. He was so drunk. I'm not saying it's a good wooing technique, but it's characteristic of the Tudors. Anyway, the dynasty fizzled out fairly quickly, and then they went up to Scotland and brought down the Stuarts, which sounded like a good idea at the time. But before we get into the horrendous story of James I and Charles I and all those characters, if you look at histories of medieval England and medieval France, people will explain that because the kings of England were broke, they had to depend on Parliament. Both Edward I and Edward III at some point or another pawned the crown jewels. I was one of them at one point had about £2 in the bank. And then they talk about medieval France and how the kings of medieval France were broke, so of course they seized power, established unilateral right to tax, and reduced Parliament to a talking shop, which hadn't met in over a century by the time of the Revolution. And in both cases, it sounds perfectly logical as you read it in isolation, but if you start asking yourself, why did it go one way in England and the other way in France? Which is, and France, for all its upheavals, is not a political nightmare like some parts of the world are. Something special happens in England. Somehow this medieval tradition of liberty withstands the rise of absolute princes during the Renaissance. I mean, Henry VIII is the perfect guy to abolish your liberties, but in England they don't let him do it. Elizabeth I, Henry's inspiring but also very frightening daughter, is at one point confronted by Edward Coke when he's Speaker of the House of Commons. It's been said that you cannot threaten from your knees. Coke actually had this talent. He was a very clever man. And he goes on his knees before Elizabeth and reminds her that the Commons has all these rights that she can't actually take away, not, of course, that she'd want to. But as you know, Elizabeth does not produce heirs. And in the end, you do get the Stuarts. And the Stuarts coming down from Scotland, where things are different. And one memorable, at 1604, James I, having realized that the English Parliament is forever making trouble, says, "In Scotland, the Parliament listens to me not only as a king, but as a counsellor. Down here, you seem to be curious from morning to night to find fault with my propositions. There, everything I suggest receives approval. Here, it all receives criticism." And they said, yep, that's about how it's going to work. One of my favorite, Edward Coke, who's been Attorney General and Speaker of the Commons, eventually he is made Chief Justice of the Civil Court, and then he's Chief Justice of the Criminal Court, after which he's thrown in jail. And at one point, one of the things that Coke is forever doing is there are these ecclesiastical courts that James I does control, and they try to take over cases where the king has a political interest. And Coke will issue writs saying, if there is a legal as well as a theological aspect to this, the ecclesiastical court can't have it. And this so infuriates James that he determines that he's going to kill Coke. And there's actually a scene in court where Coke is summoned, and his supporters literally throw themselves on the ground in front of James and beg for his life. And finally, the king relents and says, okay, fine, he can live, and off he goes hunting, because James liked to hunt. Coke goes back to court. The next day, he issues another writ prohibiting an ecclesiastical court from taking over a case. And that takes some kind of nerve. When I hear the backbenchers don't dare defy the PMO, I think to myself that we are unworthy inheritors of this tradition. Now, what James tried to do, and Charles after him, Charles I, was simply to govern without Parliament. They realized they couldn't really take it over by force. The Henry VIII option is not going to work. And they think they can raise money in other ways, including eventually Charles gets into forced loans from rich people. Anything to avoid facing Parliament, because somehow they know if they go into Parliament, they're going to be reminded of this rule that you answer the petition before we give you a dime. And at one memorable moment, James, toward the end of his life, orders the Commons not to discuss his foreign policy. So, of course, they stay up late discussing his foreign policy. And he's so incensed that he comes down to the House of Commons, seizes their journal, rips out the page with their protest in it, dissolves Parliament, and throws Coke in prison. James nevertheless dies. Charles I comes into office. And Parliament reminds him that you cannot do this kind of thing. Cook is an MP in his old age and helps to draft the Petition of Right, in which they remind him of Magna Carta and everything else. And it doesn't go down terribly well with Charles, who blunders into a civil war, which winds up with him getting executed. But notice that all the way through this story, what is happening is that the defenders of liberty are producing the old stuff. They are showing the king Magna Carta. And one about Cook in Parliament, when there's some thought that they might give in, Cook stands up and reminds everybody, Magna Carta is such a fellow as will have no sovereign. Now, this is very interesting from the point of view of the American Revolution, because what Cook is saying is that this is fundamental law that even the king in Parliament can't change. That in some sense what we have here is a written constitution emanating from the people, created, remember, before there's any kind of parliament, that controls what the legislature can do. Acts which contravene Magna Carta are unconstitutional. Now, gradually this theory erodes for reasons that I will get into after the Civil War in a rather unpleasant experiment with Puritan Commonwealth absolutism. And then when Oliver Cromwell finally dies, his son Richard gets made Lord Protector. And I think it was a sign of real illegitimacy in a regime when, without any natural reason for it, you revert to the hereditary principle because there's no other way of picking a leader. Well, North Korea, just to name one case. Well, Richard Cromwell, who acquires the nickname Tumbledown Dick, apparently he was a kind of a hapless character, except in one thing, which is that he took a look around, looked in a mirror and said, "You've got to be kidding me," handed over power and proceeded to have the longest life ever of a former ruler of England, because he just knew he was not the guy. He was not going to get into the young pretender, old pretender conspiracy. He's just like, okay, I'm Dick Cromwell, I'm a private citizen, sayonara. Well, Charles II didn't really go for this control of the monarch by the legislature either, and he tried to govern without parliament, not least by getting subsidies from the King of France with a promise that I will restore Catholicism in England. The thing about the Stuarts is they're usually lying, and he was. He's succeeded by his brother James, who was equally dishonest but far less adept, and so eventually James blunders into the Glorious Revolution and is declared to have abdicated and flees to France ignominiously, just as a woman gets punched out by some sailors. Not a happy end to a reign. And of course, Parliament, they invite William of Orange over and present him with a Bill of Rights. Say, here are the traditional liberties of Englishmen. We have always been able to do this, and any king who doesn't observe these laws is violating the ancient compact by which the British are governed. I mean, Henry of Bratton, writing in the 12th century, tells the king that the law makes the king, not the other way around. And so here's this Bill of Rights, which includes, incidentally, the right to bear arms, unless you're a stinking, wretched, treasonous Catholic. But we'll get to this later. And by this point, it is fairly well established that the king cannot ignore Parliament. The king cannot govern without Parliament. The king cannot... Charles I, at one point in his rather inglorious career, actually invaded Parliament with drawn sword to capture his opponents who had been tipped off and were gone, and he wound up standing there like a dope. Oh, the birds have fled. None of this is going to work, so the Stuarts sort of play out the string. And then you get the Hanovers, all the Georges. And that poem, George I as vile was reckoned, but viler still was George II. And what mortal ever heard any good of George III? When George IV from earth descended, God be praised, the Georges ended. And although the Hanovers had a number of unattractive qualities, but probably the least attractive of all was that they came up with a new way of trying to subvert the ancient liberties of Englishmen. Realizing that you could not govern without Parliament, they thought perhaps we can co-opt Parliament. We will appoint a ministry that curries favor with legislators, that offers them jobs and honors, and heck, a sack of gold if that's what it's going to take. And the ministry will rather descend into the legislature and then pull it up after it. And we will make MPs appendages of the court to such a point that the independence of Parliament is overcome. And it is this that, in many respects, triggers the American Revolution. I mean, there are special conditions to do with how you preserve liberty and parliamentary government across an ocean. But this is the fundamental issue that the liberties are breaking down. And as an example of this, when the Americans decide that it's time to take on Britain, and they scrape together a navy of 4 leaking converted merchant ships to take on, the British are down to about 250 top-line warships. The Americans call their flagship the Alfred, after Alfred the Great, father of the English Navy and of English liberties. I mean, these guys are facing the gallows if it fails, so they're not fooling around here. And this is the tradition. They go back to the King of Wessex in the 9th century. And one of my favorite stories about the Revolution, because it is so absolutely obscure, there's a British brigadier general establishes a post somewhere in Maine. And he says, rally to the flag, to the King of England. He called for the support of all inhabitants who, quote, are well affected to His Majesty's person and the ancient constitution under which they formerly flourished, and from restoration of which they alone can expect relief from the distressed situation they're now in. So there's the royalists. The loyalists in the Revolution are proclaiming the ancient constitution. So Brigadier General Solomon Lovell, revolutionary commander, shows up and issues a proclamation declaring that the allegiance due to the ancient constitution obliges to resist to the last extremity the present system of tyranny in the British government. So here you go on the shores of Maine in 1779. Nobody's looking. They're not writing for the history books. They're just trying to find an argument that will convince these farmers of who's right. They both uphold the ancient constitution. This is what they're fighting over. And by the way, in 1780, in the middle of all this ruckus, an MP in the British House of Commons proposes a motion saying the influence of the Crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished. And it passes, 233 to 215. All the King's efforts at bribery and corruption cannot stop Parliament from saying, yes, it's true, the executive has gotten too strong. Well, you know what the Americans do? They win the Revolutionary War, and they write a constitution. They say, this is one more example of the executive attacking our liberties, and we need a further hardening and refining of the system. So we are going to restore that written constitution like Magna Carta, but more elaborate, that will explain the separation of powers, and no member of the executive branch can be a sitting legislator. We're going to stop this Hanover business of seducing the Parliament. And so they write down how they understand the essence of the system always to have been in more detail so no one can misunderstand it. But they are not innovating here, except in the form. They are putting old wine in new bottles, very much. Because what they're doing is they're saying, here's how British liberty has evolved. It started out just the consent of the kingdom. Then we got John, he was out of hand, we had to have Magna Carta and spell some of this stuff out. Then you ran into more trouble with the king, so we had to establish parliamentary control over it. And then we had to have a petition of right, and finally we had to have the Parliament declaring the throne vacant because the king was out of line, and passing a Bill of Rights the king had to accept to become into power. Well, we'll go you one further. We'll write down the separation. Elsewhere, convention prevailed. It became clear that the monarchs could not do an end run around Parliament. And you get to the situation, Victoria's predecessor, William IV, at one point, he cannot get Parliament to support his ministry, and he says, well, I think the country supports me. We need a new election. They have a new election, and the Parliament comes back and supports his ministry. Okay, Prime Minister's in. Next time it happens, he does the same thing, gets the opposite result. The Parliament that's returned rejects his ministry. He says, fine, I'll appoint the guy I hate with the program I fear. He's Prime Minister now. No governing without Parliament. So they pull in their horns. The king accepts that there is no way around the traditional system of liberty. And it looks as though everything's kind of settled, and you get this heyday of Victorian liberty. Government is down to about 10% of GDP. Englishmen are enormously free. It's astounding when you look at the 19th century what Englishmen can do. Some of it, I mean, probably there are not a lot of devotees of opium in this room, but certainly the idea of a war on drugs would have been unthinkable because an Englishman's home is his castle. He's a deranged idiot within the walls of it. The idea of controlling access to firearms would have just been You would never have gotten anywhere with this. There's so many things you could not have done because it was just established that rights like habeas corpus, no taxation without representation, property rights are secure, the whole panoply. And everybody knows it's happened because we fought off every attack from the executive. And in the middle of all this, Canada gets a constitution similar in principle to that of the United Kingdom, which is a very interesting phrase because we get a written constitution, which the United Kingdom doesn't have. We get a federal system, which the United Kingdom does not have. We don't have parliamentary sovereignty, which by the 19th century, and there's the germ of a real problem here. By the 19th century, Parliament can do anything, in Dicey's phrase, except turn a man into a woman. Eventually, of course, it acquires that capacity as well. But why is our system similar in principle to theirs when the institutions look so different? Well, we have borrowed elements from the American system in large part to assure French Canadians that they will not be subject to the tyranny of the majority. And this weird thing that our Constitution is an act of the British Parliament, which presumably could, in a fit of madness, do something to it, but you know they won't. Canadian Parliament can't change Canada's Constitution. That way they can't renege on the deal whereby Quebec has all these guarantees, including the provincial powers. And if you listen to the founding debates over Canada, the Confederation debates are all about liberty. Preserve your British liberty. And if people who don't like Confederation want to preserve the provincial autonomy will say, don't fall for it, preserve your British liberty. And people like John A. Macdonald will say, join Confederation, preserve your British liberty. It's astonishing to me that we didn't even have an account of our founding debates. It was the late 1990s that Janet Eisenstadt and Bill Gardner and a couple of others published a record of these debates, including debates in the provincial legislatures as well as in the federal one. And they're all about liberty. And they all understand absolutely clearly this notion that because the legislature we elect controls the executive, we are free. And one of my favorite stories, there's a guy who was an absolute thorn in the side of the authorities in Lower Canada in the period, early part of the 19th century. His name is Pierre Médard. And he was forever agitating and reproaching people and saying, you say we have responsible government, you say we have a British system, but we have a cabinet here that gets money from Britain. It's not dependent on the legislature for the business of supply, and that contravenes the ancient system of British self-government. Give us back our British liberties. And this guy eventually more or less prevails. It becomes clear to the British authorities that they really are going to have to do this, because it's the way it's always been done, and these are the rights of Englishmen. And a now forgotten treasure, there's a guy named Jean-Louis Delhomme who wrote a book, The Constitution of England, in the 1770s. He did not prosper. He complains in the second edition that for all the money he made, he might as well have burned his manuscript to boil his kettle. But having come to England from Switzerland and been baffled by it in many ways, but fascinated, he started to look into the British system of liberty. And one of the many marvelous metaphors that he brings up is that the executive in Britain is like a powerful ship with all the rigging and the strong hull ready to go anywhere, but the legislature at any moment may draw off the water. And that's what the legislature can do by denying money. And so here's a John A. Macdonald praising arguing for Confederation. We will enjoy here that which is the great test of constitutional freedom. We will have the rights of the minority respected. In all countries, the rights of the majority take care of themselves, but it is only in countries like England, enjoying constitutional liberty and safe from the tyranny of a single despot or of an unbridled democracy, that the rights of minorities are regarded. And then Wilfrid Laurier, sort of the missing father of Confederation, the guy who showed up late, once said, Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. And this at the time, remember, Laurier is the guy who turned Canada from the natural Tory to the natural Liberal place. After Laurier, no leader of the Federal Liberal Party failed to become Prime Minister until Stéphane Dion pulled it off 110 years later. Quite an extraordinary business. And by the way, Louis Saint-Laurent in the 1957 election said, any ideas of non-essential interference by the government is repugnant to the Liberal Party. And again, I say, if you look back at the debates in the Nova Scotia Assembly, a guy called Stuart Campbell, I am a free man. I claim the rights and attributes of a free man, speaking in the presence of a British free assembly. It's just marvelous stuff. And they all knew the story that I have been telling you about the establishment of the right of free people to elect representatives who would control the executive by denying it funds if it misbehaved. And then this story gets lost in the mid-20th century for all kinds of reasons. Nobody talks about Magna Carta anymore. It's a dead letter, never repealed. Apparently, if you try and bring it up in court, you don't do terribly well. So I'm not suggesting you attempt this as a legal strategy, but I'd like to bring it back. But people now think we didn't have rights till the Charter. And then these rights were bestowed upon us by intellectuals who gazed into the future and thought, how shall we shape man? And gave us an appalling hodgepodge with a notwithstanding clause that covers the essentials but not the peripherals, and an amending formula you can't use. And one of the astonishing things about our Constitution to me is that it neither comes from the people, can't be amended the way the Americans can do theirs, nor from the Parliament. It cannot be amended by the Parliament. For all practical purposes, it can't be amended. My editors nearly balked when I wrote a piece on how you'd actually have to amend it to get rid of the Senate, and they eventually relented and published it on the grounds that it just is that bad. And I'm almost out of my time, and I'm sure I've tried your patience beyond endurance, so I'll keep this point very short. But one of the problems is that we now expect a constant stream of exciting innovations from our government. That's my point early on about Apple and the operating system. That if you had a politician running on the theory that, well, I shall faithfully uphold the laws as they exist. Well, what's your platform? I don't have a platform. I have no innovations. They would be treated as insane. If you ever read a federal budget, and I'm not saying you should, but if you ever do, and I do that for my sins, that's one of the things I do for a living, they start out with a whole long list of new things. Here, we've got this exciting new tax break. Oh, this wonderful change in your life. You got to get 150, 200 pages in before they tell you what they're actually spending the money on. This is not a budget in the normal sense of the word. As I've pointed out, if your spouse were to say to you, we have a problem with our expenses, we need a budget, and you came back with a list of dazzling new things you'd bought, there'd be trouble. And Hank Williams' song about the doghouse would certainly start playing. And this is significant in part because it's not obvious to me how a legislature can get back to what it's meant to be doing if we expect of the executive that, blessed with a mandate from the people, it will produce this marvelous array, like every budget day is Christmas. And there's this packages, and we shake them and try and guess what's in them, and you open them, they're even better than you could have imagined. Again, you look at the American president's oath of office, there's to uphold the Constitution, and then the Constitution does say that from time to time he can recommend measures he considers expedient. But it is not the job of the president to produce policy innovations. And Blackstone, when he talks about what Parliament does, he does three things. One is, if the common law is found not to reach far enough in some area, then Parliament will extend it. If the common law is found to reach a little too far in some area, then Parliament will bring it back a little bit. And if there are specific things that need to be remedied, Parliament will remedy them. You look at legislation in the 18th century, most of it was more what we'd consider municipal bylaws and zoning variances. Very little of it was the sort of thing that we think of as laws, like, oh, a whole new employment insurance system, or wow, millions of dollars for high-tech companies or venture capital, or gee whiz, what next? And if the job of the legislature is to make sure the executive is faithfully implementing the law, that it is neither doing things the law doesn't specify or doing them in ways that are procedurally unfair, and if it does, there will be investigations, subpoenas, there may be impeachments, and there will be denial of funds. It's hard to do that when what you need to do is elect somebody on horseback who has a bunch of followers who will assuredly help him to bring in these marvelous new changes that we expect every 3 or 4 years. I was noticing that the Premier of British Columbia, Christy Clark, as you know, won a surprise victory in the last election but lost her own seat. And she's now got one of her colleagues to step down. She's going to run in Kelowna West and win. Hooray, hooray. And she'll almost certainly win. But she's not running for Premier. She's running to be MLA because we've convinced ourselves that the premier or prime minister must be a legislator. But why do they have to be a legislator? Their job is to head the executive branch, to execute the laws, which shouldn't be changing all the time, because if you can't tell what the law is, or a man who knows the law today cannot say what it will be tomorrow, you do not have liberty under law. It's a convention, and it's a dangerously seductive convention, because it makes you think that the prime minister or the premier was elected by the people. And you saw this when Brent Rathgeber said, "I've had enough, I'm out of here, I'm not a trained SEAL." And the prime minister's communications director said, well, he has to step down. The Conservatives won that seat. That's an image of an election like a plebiscite, that we're all voting for Stephen Harper, and he's now got a mandate to do anything he wants, and a bunch of people who, for some reason no one can remember, have to show up and say aye on command when he does it. It's not the job of legislators. I mean, Brent Rathgeber was elected on a platform, and part of his job, if the executive seems not to be carrying out the platform on which he was sent to Parliament, it is his duty not to support them. But in order to get that back, we have to get to this older understanding of how our government's meant to work. And to get to an older understanding and be happy that we're at an older understanding, we have to shake off this feeling that new is always better. You know, and I grant that improvements in software are not always unwelcome, but you think about a restaurant that you like. If you have a restaurant you like, you don't want to go there every time and find that the menu has changed, the chef has changed, they've got different servers, the price list has been altered. You want to get back there and find the same meals because you know they're good. And in fact, in many respects, public policy would be like that. Essentially, those rights in Magna Carta, that you cannot be taken to court except following due process, that you cannot have taxes without the common consent of the kingdom, that everyone shall have access, as one of the promises of Magna Carta, to no one will we deny, delay, or sell justice. And I think with the extraordinary delays in court cases now and the incredible legal fees, I think we're being deprived of a critical Magna Carta right. If we had these rights, we could make the modern world work. Not perfectly, no human contrivance is perfect. We don't need a new legal setting. Those traditional rights create a robust framework within which people may make moral decisions, live their lives, control their governors, insist on seeing the spirit of Alfred and Canute manifested, not the arrogance of a James I. That we decide what the government does because we send legislators able to stop it when it gets out of hand. And I'm almost done here, but one thing, I'm causing myself agony, glottal agony here. Because people always talk about the Harper government or the McGuinty or the Wynne government and so on. And I keep saying, no, the government is the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary branches. What you have is the Harper ministry. And I'm not just being pedantic. What you have is the top of the executive branch over there, one part of the government, which is meant to be checked by another part of the government. And the language, the Harper government, implies that they own the whole thing by right, and when they act, the government acts. Now, it's obviously not true because courts are always doing stuff that nobody can control. It's a subject for another day. But we need to recapture the terminology and the understanding to get ourselves back, as I said at the outset, what is the story that we're part of? And we are blessed because we're part of a story of liberty. Now, some people weren't blessed. Some people who live in some part of the world where people are not free somehow look across the globe, see Canada, and say, that's where I should be. That's how I think things ought to be. And incredible hardship, they come here and they join this story. Others come here for other reasons. And again, story for another day. But most of us were just lucky. We're born into this story of freedom that's 1,000 years old and more. That we are free because of the men who fought with Alfred against the Danes. That we are free because of the people on both sides at the Battle of Hastings. That we are free because of the people who stood up to King John. And always the story was the executive is trying to subvert the rights of the people by freeing itself from control by their representatives. And every time they've tried it, they have failed. And every time they've tried it, we've come back with a stronger understanding of our rights, a better articulation, and improved institutions to keep what we always had. That is our story as free people. If we get the story back, we can start to get back the freedoms. That these ideas of overriding your right to due process, that the regulations that dispense with the need for a search warrant, that the vexatious imposition on your right to do as you choose on your own property if you're not harming somebody else, that the government's right to just rummage through our email because you never know what might turn up. All of this stuff arises because we decided we didn't like, or somebody decided, and we haven't succeeded in convincing them or otherwise preventing it, that what was old was bad, and that all these innovations must be good. And we need to get that story back. I didn't even know the name of Edward Cook, by the way, because it's spelled Coke and pronounced Cook, and I think this bothers people sometimes. I had a reader of the newspaper say, I like your columns, but I think you need to know about Edward Cook. And I said, well, probably I do. Who is he? And they sent me this biography, The Lion and the Throne, and I was just, how come I never heard of this guy? Why isn't there a statue of him on Parliament Hill? But that's the starting point, is to get back this idea that we inherited a treasure of political liberty that actually comes out of the Dark Ages through the Middle Ages and was refined. Most of its most critical refinements, including a statement of a Bill of Rights in Magna Carta, the notion of a fundamental law arising from the people that legislatures cannot override even if clever people are at the top, a set of rules about the Parliament, and particularly the House of Commons, controlling money bills and controlling its own procedures. All of this stuff is the story. And then you turn to the next page, and it's the chapter that you're going to write. But if you know what the story is, you know who the heroes and the villains are. You know what's meant to happen. You know that you are the kind of people who should have a statue of Alfred the Great on Parliament Hill and a statue of Edward Cook, and should be worthy of walking past those statues and explaining to people who they are. All of that is this legacy of liberty from Magna Carta via the Middle Ages to you. That's who we are, and that's who we need to make sure that we remain.